Hello, and welcome to Research-Based Narratives. My name is Sakshi Kumar, and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator at Writers and Books. I am an Asian American woman with brown skin, short black hair, and I'm wearing a white shirt with a light blue jean jacket. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands on which we live and work. We are recording this panel from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Seneca people, or the keeper of the Western Door. As I mentioned, this is research-based narratives, a hybrid of storytelling and research. Research-based narratives offer readers a fresh, exciting, and accessible way of deeply immersing themselves in nonfiction. Here, three deeply knowledgeable writers will share their craft. Our panelists are Calvin Eaton, Tamara Payne, and Alicia Puglianese. Our moderator is Michael McGandy. Our panelists and our moderators' books will be available at the Writers and Books' indie bookstore, Ampersand Books. I encourage you to read their full bios on our website, wab.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And my name's Michael McGandy. I'm the director of University of South Carolina Press. I'm a white male of 55 years of age, darkening red hair, pinkish complexion with eyeglasses, and wearing a pink shirt. And I'm delighted to be joined here by Alicia, Tamara, and Calvin, three nonfiction writers of varied interests, varied expertise in where they focus their interests, and universally and uniformly excellent ability to convey their passion for a subject matter in compelling nonfiction prose. And what we want to talk about today is that, and compelling is a word that's used in the Writers and Books summary of the panel that we have here. And I do think that all three bring that to their work. And if indeed into this conversation we can share the inspirations, the techniques, the goals, the reader experience that sort of compose or make up what a compelling reading experience is, then I think we'll have achieved our task. I was joking with everyone just before we began recording that, of course, this task, it's not an hour long and one's done, right? Excellent writing in any genre, fiction or nonfiction, is an ongoing task. But I think this opens a good conversation, and I think that you'll be able to find us if you want to have follow-up questions online via email or in other sorts of ways. And I think we'd all be perfectly happy to do that. So I want to welcome all three authors, and I want to give each one an opportunity to talk a little bit more about themselves as writers and their interests, and give you a little fuller sense of themselves before we get into the conversation, because every conversation comes out of personal experience and personal interests. So I have a little more sense of one another. I think will be great. So Tamara, could I ask you to begin, please?
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Michael, for moderating this and having us here to have this very interesting conversation. I'm Tamara Payne. I'm a co-author of The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X. This is a book written with my father, who Les Payne, who was an investigative journalist, award-winning editor, and syndicated columnist. And his book came out of actually conversations that he had with relatives of Malcolm, starting with his brothers. And what he learned from these original conversations was that there was a lot about Malcolm, the person, that we did not know. Malcolm X being Malcolm X. He's a very interesting person, as we know, historical and has changed the lives for many people through his story. But we did not know who Malcolm was as a person. And so through learning about Malcolm as a younger brother to Wilfred and Filbert Little, and then through applying journalism, which means you're going to find people, get sources, and get their stories to help fill out this story about who Malcolm is. And the whole point of starting this book project was to look at Malcolm, not just what we don't know about him, but look at him in the context of his family, of who he is, and into the world he was born into. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm an African-American woman, short brown hair, wearing a gray sweater and black pants. You're muted. Michael, you're muted.
I know. But goodness, Calvin, unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about your own work and yourself.
Hi everyone. My name is Calvin Eaton, and I am a black with, with my age. I'm black African American. I have short cropped hair. I wear round glasses, dark brown skin, and I have on like a checkered red and blue shirt today that's collared. And I am a author and writer. My areas of expertise are in terms of the focus areas and interest areas include poetry and cookbook and food writing, as well as a scholar of African American history and culture. And so when Tamara talked about Malcolm X, made me think about a book that I read, I think last year, or maybe 2 years ago now. I'm always gravitating not just in my own writing, but also my reading um, to nonfiction. And another book that comes to mind as we think about expounding on who Malcolm X was a person was written by the scholar Anna Malika Tubbs, who wrote The Three Mothers. How the mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin shaped the nation. And so, for those who might be interested in understanding more about who Malcolm X was as a person, I would highly recommend this book, especially I think at a time where politically and socio-politically our nation seems to be grappling with how we talk about history and what we do and don't talk about. And I think we've seen over the last decade, more recently, this sort of flattening of historical Black figures, specifically civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, where their words and their philosophies have been clipped and whitewashed and made into these sort of palatable sound bites. So the work that historians and writers like Tamara are doing to really give and showcase the full lives of these people who none of us have the opportunity to talk to directly, but through their writing and through their scholarship, I think that that's what really inspires me as a writer, thinking about how I can, while I'm living, in many ways shape the narrative about not just my own life, but also what's happening around me for future generations, because we know that, especially in the African American community and culture, so much of our narratives and our history has been intentionally and implicitly erased, whether through physical destruction of our archives, of our libraries, of our businesses, but also just through the political landscape and how our work and works of scholars like Malcolm X has been intentionally subverted, if you will. So I think that the work that folks like Tamara are doing and other scholars is so important, especially as we think about, um, history being living and part of our present as well. And I'm just so grateful and thankful that I have the ability and the privilege of being able to write about my life and experiences in the world as a person living at the intersection of many marginalized identities. And I think that's the crux of writers and how we need, how we need to think about all of ourselves as writers and creating these time capsules, whether it be through an op-ed in a newspaper, the New York Times, or your local paper. Local news is so important, or a scrapbook. That those seem to be losing popularity in our digital world. These physical archives and documents are so important, especially in a digital age. So I'm really happy to talk more about some of these threads for sure.
Great, thank you. Alicia, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Hi, my name is Alicia Puglianesi. Um, I'm a white woman with glasses and short brown hair, wearing a black kind of checkered shirt. Um, And I my most recent book is called In Whose Ruins. It's about sort of weaving together different sites of landscape and memory and histories of settler colonialism and extraction in the United States. Um, and I'm really grateful to be here on this panel. And I've just been like taking notes because I think that what Tamara and Calvin have already said is kind of like a lot of strands that I'm also really interested in. Um, so I'm trained as a historian of science and medicine. And so, you know, what Calvin was saying about archives, like that's definitely like a lot of my training, like we're taught to kind of like find an obscure archive and like see what's in there. And in the process of doing that kind of work, um, there's like I've just come increasingly to take very seriously, you know, first of all, and what made me interested in doing history is the need for context. Like Tamara was saying, like we can't just like think about history in like factoids. We really need that context. And even though we're working in nonfiction, that is a form of world building, like building the world of the past in a way that like people can understand and relate to, but also appreciate like how different it was and like how people were the like just world in which people were acting. Um, and like along with that is like a responsibility to the dead, um, and like a responsibility of memory, that is like remembering carefully. Um, and so yeah, I think those are kind of a lot of my interests. And, uh, you know, I've been interested in kind of like just very obscure people whose work, you know, whose sort of traces you come across in the archive and how they kind of can illuminate these small corners of the past that like that are sort of part of this larger context that helps us understand kind of what it was like to be in that time and place. Yeah.
That's great. I think all three of you have touched on your interest, but also your ethics. Like an ethics of writing is clearly part of this. And I was saying about beginning the conversation with inspiration, which all three of you have touched on interest and inspiration connecting to one another, and now ethics is interjected into that already. So maybe ask Calvin to take this on as the first person, and we can sort of go around each person speaking and then see where the conversation leads us, question by question. But think about where you do start with your work. You know, do you start with an archive and a body of material that you immerse yourself in, and then find the inspiration for the work, or do you have the question and find the material? Or one of any other 4, 5, 6 other possibilities of departure, right? The point of departure for writing is varied, but if you could tell a little bit about, or maybe even offer an example of a recent book, and talking about the inspiration and how that led you on to devote hours and hours and hours, of course, to both the research and then the writing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was made of me for sort of saw myself as this sort of formal published author or writer. Have always written op-eds and really since 2012 started my writing career as a blogger and content creator on the internet. And it really wasn't until around that time and dealing with some personal experiences with disability that I started really to more formally see myself as a nonfiction writer. I think, you know, before these personal experiences, I really saw content creation and, you know, writing for a blog or website as sort of separate, or not real writing, if you will, especially being someone who loves history and loves scholarship and reading academic writing. But it was really my own personal experiences as dealing with chronic illness that really was the inspiration for me to become a poetry writer and writing poetry. And I really never had sort of had the inspiration to write poetry in a published way until I was experiencing some health challenges. And this is, really 2011, 2012. And then that really was the catalyst for me writing my first book of poetry and publishing it. And really that experience and that process of just being inspired. I mean, I don't even know where the words came from, really just through this, feeling and depression and going through these range of emotions that was the inspiration for this book of poetry. Living with Fibromyalgia is my first work. And I would say that really was sort of breaking down for me the this mind shift of like, no, maybe I am an author of note, if you will, and ever since then, really started to think more about all of these different threads of novel starts that I've done over the years, and really had cobbled them together in different composition notebooks, but never really finished anything. And it was really that inspiration and experience of writing poetry and then self-publishing that first work that I really started to create a digital archive of the different novels that I had been started over the years. Even when I was, in my early 20s and even in high school, I talking about archiving, I had thumb drives of voice memos that I had started. Um, I remember when I was, in my, 14, 15, I would like sing song lyrics into voice recorders and all of that kind of stuff. My parents, for a time, were really big on um, archiving our family history through VHS. And I remember my dad, we have videos of, it was like, I think you kind of get on a train of it for many years and then it sort of tapers off. But we have scrapbooks and VHS tapes. So I think that early history of thinking about, not in a formal way, but just like, and I grew up at a time where it was analog, and then I also migrated in the digital world. So I'm an older millennial. So I very distinctly remember this idea of cassette tapes, VHS tapes, CD, burning CDs to a disc in that world, whether it be music or some other content. And then now our sort of digital, the Napster, all of that age, and then now iTunes, and now all the ways that we digitally archive. And I think that history is embedded. And now I think as someone who's always writing and always taking notes, I'm always thinking about how do I preserve this in some type of a folder digitally. So I think that as I think about writing and capturing stories, it's equally important for me to think about how do I store this information so I can return to it, but also again, so future generations can access it. Because I think because now we rely so heavily on digital mediums to house and store our information, that tangible asset that we know that historians like Tamara and Alicia need, and Michael, to reference the past, I think is sometimes lost because there's this ubiquity that we think, oh well, it's online, it's always going to be there. But then I think, at least for me, and I'm curious to hear what Alicia and Tamara think. Maybe we're not as cognizant or thoughtful about how we're preserving the information because there is this idea that digital is forever. But for me, I think it's been so important for me in the last 5 years or so to actually publish these stories, whether it be a cookbook. So I wrote a cookbook last year, Just Desserts. And it was really important to me for this most recent cookbook project to get these recipes from a digital, from my iPhone or from my iCloud to an actual book that the public can hold, that I can hold, that's a published hard copy book. and for that first edition not focus on an ebook, because to me, I think there's still this sense that we almost, to me, it feels like the more books feel more real when people can hold them and check it out at the library or put it on the shelf. And I think that I'm really fascinated how even in this digital world, I don't know if any of you have the statistics, but it doesn't feel like hard copy books are going anywhere. I was just doing some reading in Barnes and Noble recently locally, and I was just looking around like this is not even a huge bookstore, and it's thousands of books in here in this store. So I think, as a reader and as a writer, it's so important that we think about how do we get these stories onto paper, into the hands of each other, our communities, for posterity, honestly.
Yeah. And I'll enter a small business point, and then I'll ask Alicia to address the matter of inspiration. I think ebooks are holding pretty steady around 30% of marketplace, and that's a pretty stable percentage right now. Audiobooks are the ones that are moving up in terms of medium. And I don't have a number for that, but there's no doubt that audio is growing, and that both print and E are sort of stabilizing around a 1/3, 2/3 ratio. But Alicia, go ahead. Thinking about your own inspiration, you talked about archive in your own introduction, so clearly the archive is important. Do you go to the archive with a question? You go to the archive with curiosity to find the question?
Um, yeah, I guess a combination of both, or like all of the above to the options of like a specific archive, a personal experience, or like an intellectual question. Like I think you seek out particular archives, you seek out things that are sort of seem unresolved, or like that pose some kind of puzzle. Um, Whether that question is like, what's missing from this picture, like how has this archive previously been, excluded or kind of interpreted in different ways, and like what can you bring to it as a researcher, um, but also like looking for insight into those larger questions, like you know why is the landscape the way it is, and that gets to the things that we encounter in our own lives. So you know starting from the personal, and like how does something uh, that you observe uh, affect you, and how are you situated and positioned in relation to um, institutions, power, um, and like what kind of insights can we get from looking at the past, and like obscure corners of the past, um, in terms of like what ordinary people thought and believed, um, that may or may not persist into the present day. Um, so that's like kind of very broadly like the like nexus of things that gets me interested in a particular project or set of stories. And I've also always had kind of an interest in like the margins of science, the things that are kind of on that border of like science and faith or belief. Um, and so those always make for very interesting uh, primary sources and archives, kind of like eccentric visionaries, um, whose understandings of like society and of reality itself are in some ways like very radical and revolutionary, and in other ways kind of like entangled with all of the problems that exist in their own time. Um, so those are things that I guess like compel me, um, and then like sort of plug into larger questions about how does science operate, and like how does belief operate, So yeah, I'll stop there.
And Tamara, please. You're unmuted. There you go.
Yeah, I just want to be unmuted. Couple of things occurred to me when I was listening to Alicia and Calvin was when we talked about digital, the digital world, for example. I'm actually more in the camp of having books and hard copy because even when you're doing your research in the digital world, you're constantly printing things out and storing it somewhere, usually in page protectors and probably chronologically as it occurs to your subject. Um, but the other thing I found also really useful, and I don't know how often you guys find you have to do it, is that sometimes when you do your research, even online, you'll find that things are missing. They're no longer up for whatever reasons. And then you have to find out, well, what happened? So again, another reason for having hard copy. But one solution in that is to always look at the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine, which has always been helpful too. But for me, as far as inspiration, I think I already talked about the inspiration behind our book, but curiosity is just having curiosity in life and just questions and then seeking to answer them. And to me, I lean more towards dealing with hard research because what happens is when you're doing a lot of digital research, you're not having conversations with people who are involved with the subject as physical conversations. And I think that's important to our work also as writers and researchers. I mean, it's understanding, the human ticks when somebody's telling you information, and understanding whether the information they're giving you is hitting them seriously. Are they How passionate are they about the topic? I mean, these are really important things that we lose when we just do digital research and internet research. So I just want to add that.
And as you think about conversations, you're thinking specifically about interview matter, or
Well,
you're
let's
also thinking about
looking at
reading in an
letters.
archive.
Who holds on to letters? And if you're just writing emails to people and they have letters that you might want to look at, you also may want to know how important these letters were to that family, because it also gives you a sense of if you're writing about a person and somebody has their letters, how willing are they to willing to share that information? Kind of give you a sense of what was their relationship like, and you really get to see that when you're speaking to people.
I think that makes sense. It also makes me think about how much research now is done by a keyword search, which will pull you to a very specific place that will give you the exact bit of information, but you may not read above and you may not read below. And that also it's a different sort of conversation, but it's also conversation is context. It's widening out rather than focusing in. I think the digital, alas, focuses people in.
I think it's just really important that we don't lose contact and lose the ability to have these conversations when just asking for information, sharing information, telling our stories. It's just the whole point of telling stories is for our communities to grow and move. So um, I do get concerned with us, especially coming out of the pandemic, just being in kind of these separate places and not necessarily communicating verbally, a voice on the phone, even meeting face to face. I mean, I think there's a real connection there that gets lost when you just do internet, or just going to a library and not speaking to a librarian who may have a wealth of information or may know somebody, that is not going to be in the catalog, right? In the library catalog. But if you have a conversation with them, you'll find out that way.
I'm thinking just, in some sense, truism for truism about, fiction and nonfiction. Fiction, they say, write what you know, right? I mean, that's like a stock phrase. It sounds like very much within one of the inspirations for people who write nonfiction is write what you don't know, write what you want to know, write what you think other people ought to know or want to know. And staying with that theme, just the fiction and nonfiction, you know, nonfiction at bottom communicates, fiction at bottom, I guess, does many things. It gives you, it has a strong affective dimension, it has an aesthetic dimension, but clearly the two come together, right? And great nonfiction has certain qualities of fiction built into it at the very least, right? Someone like myself, an editor, like people need to turn pages, whatever you're writing, people need to turn pages. So could you reflect a little bit upon um, the divide between fiction and nonfiction? Calvin, you went from poetry to cookbooks, right? So clearly you see a continuum here in terms of the creative and the supposedly fact-based writing. Alicia, do you want to begin and just sort of take on the question of where fiction and nonfiction meet, where they divide, and how different sorts of interest in compelling reading influences your work?
Sure. I think it's a great question. I mostly read fiction, except for work, where I'm reading academic nonfiction. And so I see them as very similar in a lot of ways. It's almost like nonfiction, and not to um, not to underrate the work that fiction writers do, but writing nonfiction is like narrative with responsibility, where you're like, I need to really understand this. Like, I need to understand what's going on many different levels. Um, and, as Tamara was saying, if there are people alive who know about this, who have some, experience connected to the period you're writing about, like, you need to talk to them. Um, and it, can become very like, yeah, there's just like a sense of responsibility that you need to be faithful to people's experiences and situations, and just like try to convey that as faithfully as possible, um, while also identifying like what is the narrative, what is the like through line that's going to connect a reader today with this material, um, and kind of like pacing that in a way that people can kind of recognize as a story. um, and I think that there is a tension in terms of like how much information to include and how much to kind of pare down, and just try to like tell a story. And that's something that like I'm definitely still negotiating, because just like having, it's like the more you learn, the more you're like, oh, this is so incredibly complicated. Like I need to really like provide all of this backstory. And so yeah, I think there's a balance there that is really a lot of work to like compress down and distill like what is the informational content here and context, and how can like we sort of evoke that without being too didactic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tamara, want to take that on?
The crossroads of where fiction and nonfiction meet, I think that both are important genres. I mean, storytelling, I feel is just important, um, for us everywhere, and whether it's fiction or nonfiction, because even in fiction, while you are creating worlds that may not exist, we still have to be able to relate to them. Somebody still has to relate to them. There has to be some kind of connection. So there is a tethering there. In nonfiction, which I'm really grounded in, because I don't write a lot of fiction, honestly. So I'm grounded in nonfiction. In nonfiction, I agree with Alicia. It's a responsibility to, get as close to the truth as you can. Um, and and in journalists, we don't like to get into the area where it's those you may never know, because kind of the role of the journalist is to find out as much as we can. So the problem I find is, you never know when necessarily when it's end, as you say, as Alicia has said, that the story grows and there's more information, you can get lost in the work of it. I tend to look at with nonfiction that research and writing are very different. skill set. So it's kind of like when you're writing, that's different. You have your research and you're using the research and you're shaping your research. But when you're researching, that's kind of where it just kind of grows. And at some point, you're still, you still have to shape it, and you have to meld it. But it's difficult. But I think they're both storytelling is just really important. Period. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and thank God for both. Um, and there was one other point I wanted to make on that. Oh, the importance of editors. The editors help you with that too, with understanding what might be too much or not necessarily connected, to the story. And you can always disagree with them to compare to what your point is, but editors are very important. So,
Thank you for saying so. Calvin.
Yeah, I think right now we live in a time where writers and authors are being really creative, even in the nonfiction space. So I read a lot of the memoir genre, and even for my own recent cookbook, in the beginning sections of it, I have I wouldn't say a huge lot, but I do have I would say, memoir-ish section in the beginning to sort of talk about my history with living gluten-free and a little bit of background. And I tried to write it in a way that was engaging and funny and humorous and all of those things. So I think that, especially in the memoir genre and even in cookbooks, so many authors are interjecting either fictitious creativity in how they write recipes or the head notes for recipes, or they're adding elements of nonfiction beyond just here's a list of ingredients and here's a recipe or instructions on how to prepare it. You can find cookbooks now that actually are really more of a complete memoir or a travel log through a certain region of the world. Um, and when I think about some of my favorite memoirs as well, the memoir genre is not just, it's changed radically in the last decade, where many authors are writing their the history of themselves or themselves through their lens through a collection of essays. Um, there's graphic novels that many authors are now writing to sort of make their life story more palatable for teen audiences, which is really cool to see. So there's just so much creativity in the nonfiction genre, and there's really no one way. I think that's, for me, I think why I read so much nonfiction and memoir, because there is just so many different cool ways in which authors are telling their story. And then now we have, with so many authors now, like someone, who am I thinking? All Boys Aren't Blue, George M. Johnson, if I'm getting the name correct, their name. Many authors now are getting their book opted for now Netflix shows or um, unlimited series now, and they're taking now this nonfiction and making it to the big screen, if you will, the silver screen. And so then there's now elements of fiction added to someone's life story to make it work for a TV show or a movie, if you will. I think about Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he, he wrote his autobiography or memoir, and then he also has a novel called The Water Dancer, which has elements. He's adding some historical nonfiction to that, which sort of talks about Harriet Tubman. So there's so many ways now where the genres are blending and mixing and intersecting, and I think it's um, really inspiring as a writer, but as a reader, but for sure as a writer, because I think sometimes, especially when I think about telling my own story, it's like, does anyone want to read my story? Like, who wants to read this? But there's so much creativity you can put into the memoir or autobiography genre now, the sky's really the limit and how you can do that. And so I've been really excited to see the different creative ways of which nonfiction now is being executed in the literary world.
Yeah, I think there's fiction and there's creativity, and clearly fiction does not have a monopoly on creativity by any means. But thinking about both Alicia and Tamara used either the word truth or getting closer to the truth, and I just wondered, is there any sense of an ethic of keeping a clear line between fiction and nonfiction, allowing creativity to go over that, but is there an ethical dimension for any of you in terms of keeping some sort of line there?
Can you restate the question just really quick? I'm sorry, Tamara. Michael, can you restate the question?
Sure. Presuming that creativity crosses between or encompasses fiction and nonfiction, is there still an ethical responsibility to keep a distinction between fiction and nonfiction if we define provisionally nonfiction as something that is pursuing the truth or trying to get closer to the truth, using Tamara's phrase?
My answer for that would be yes, there is importance of doing that, because years later, people will find out for you and expose that things were not so true, as we keep finding out in the news today. But another point I'd like to add to Calvin's point about the creativity of nonfiction, and particularly with memoirs and even biographies, are operas. We have the Fire Down in My Bones, which is an opera that Charles Blow wrote. It's about his life. And then we also have the Malcolm X opera, which has been traveling around the country and just ended in Seattle in February. How are we putting these experiences, that nonfiction experiences, to music or even poetry? As Calvin can even speak more on. I haven't seen the fire set up in my bones yet, but I have seen the Malcolm X opera. And one thing I will say is that with that opera, it's not, I would say, a traditional opera, because the music was jazz, and their lyrics were very poetic, and it was in English. So it was a very interesting experience to see that.
Yeah, I think that those are all really amazing examples of like creative explorations of history and like um, ways that writing about sort of factual events that occurred um, also can involve some degree of like channeling like the spirit of something. And that's like that is a really interesting challenge, to try to like make creative work that gives voice to, a particular individual in the past, or like, telling a story of the past in a way that's like kind of very accessible and engaging. And uh, like I think it's also a little bit scary, like to not have footnotes to fall back on, to be like, in a lot of the work that I do, it's very much like the receipts are in the footnotes. You can check anything that I'm claiming for yourself, and go to the source. So I think that there are other kinds of writing that I've done, like for writing for the internet, for like web platforms where they don't let you have footnotes, and like there either is an editor and there's a fact checker, but like then the words are just out there, um, without without sourcing, and like even that makes me like a little bit nervous. But again, sort of like I recognize that in the name of narrative, like someone wants to learn about this topic, they've clicked on an article, and they just like want to get into the story. And so like I think as a writer, like I can do that. Um, but there's like a certain degree of risk in like um, trying to like yeah, trying to simplify things. And again, it's just like something to approach with like with care and responsibility. Um, so yeah, I think maybe I'll get there. I think I'm interested in writing fiction, just in order to be able to be like a little bit looser about those things, and like create, a historically accurate uh context, but like not have to worry about, whether a specific person would have said this thing. Um, and so yeah, it's definitely a space, as Tamara and Calvin were discussing, where like I think there is room for kind of experimentation, in like crossing genres.
Well, I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate to your question, Michael. I think that as a nation, just speaking from the U.S. perspective, we've already seen, or we've seen a history of, I guess I would just say very simply, whitewashing of history, and thinking about the stories that we've told about the history of this country and the people who have been impacted by colonization and redlining and gentrification. Much of those stories have been told in a way that we might say is not very accurate, despite what we've all been told or acculturated to think. So I think that we have been reclaiming these narratives, marginalized communities, indigenous communities, Black communities. When we think about Tulsa, many people, white, Black, or other race, etc., have never learned about Tulsa and Greenwood, and we know that it was initially called a race riot for many decades, and that language has changed to a massacre. We think about um, Victor Lukerson, just I think in 2018 or recently published, I haven't read it yet, but Built from the Fire. Many people are just now learning about Tulsa and what that looked like in 2020. We think about the 1619 Project and Nicole Hannah Jones, and that really lit a proverbial fire in the literary, but also the scholar world, the history world, historians, about how we've taught the history of the United States and chattel slavery. So I say that to say that we know that history has often been written by those in power, and what messages and what is the narrative that those in power and who have had privilege want to create. And so I think that's why it's so important that we continue to push for diversity in the literary world, and truly that the stories are written and told by the people who have not been in power, because when that happens, we know that we get a very different accounting of, for example, why did the Civil War begin? And we somehow still have this debate about whether slavery should or should not be said as a reason for that, right? So I think that that goes to show us that even this sort of history that we know is also a perspective, is one perspective. And in many cases, that perspective has been either intentionally skewed or um, disinformation as part of that intentionally. So I think that that's really important when we think about like what is fact and what is fiction. Well, so much of what we have been told is fact is actually not. Christopher Columbus and Columbus Day, and etc. On and on. So I think that that's really important to think about for sure.
Thank you. That is turning the conversation just a little bit to readers and your readers' experience. I'd love to hear from the three of you, and ask you, Calvin, to start, if you don't mind. When you published your books and you release them into the world and it's out of your hands, and you're feeling both very satisfied and very nervous, how do you define success, and what means for your work to be successful out in the literary marketplace and or in the hands of individual readers and before the minds of individual readers?
Well, that still seems to be ongoing for me. I just published my cookbook collection in December, and um, I mean, it was a very limited run, but it sold out. And so for me, as a fairly new published author, that was success, and it sold out in a way that I wasn't prepared for. So I think that um, for me, for that project, just really getting it out into the world was how I was defining success, and anything beyond that was icing on the cake. But for me, it's just really making the connections with readers, and I'm still building that pipeline. I'm working on my second print run of my cookbook, if you know, and all of that. But I think just the fact, just being able to, you know, see photos and connect with people, and you know, all of the book events that I had before the before the beginning of 2024, the new year, was really surreal. You know, having folks come out and signing the book and all the copies and all of that was really surreal. So I think that I know that the ways in which I define success will be different. I think I self-published this, you know, again, this most recent collection, and um, as I, you know, potentially work with a book, a more traditional publisher in the future, I know that success will change, and what's defined as successful will change, you know, maybe for each project even. So I really hope to continue to look at it as an iterative process, and also just give myself grace, because the marketing and the distribution of a book is so difficult and so hard, even for the most well published and prolific authors. I recently had the privilege of meeting the author, and I can't think of her name right now, but of the Biscuit children's series, Alyssa, I think it's her first name. And just to hear her talk about, like, it's still hard for me and I still am nervous when they've published, you know, well over 100 books, is just consolation to know that maybe that feeling never goes away, no matter how many books you sold.
Probably true. Um, Tomorrow, how do you see success of your work?
Particularly for The Dead Are Rising is really just seeing the book finalized and published. My father passed away before it was published, so it was making sure that it would see the light of day. And I was really, you know, I was really happy with that. And then because for me, it wasn't simply that to get it published, but I wanted that, I knew that this was such an important project that people needed to read it. They needed to see this story. They needed to see how this played out and how all of, you know, the events that led up to this long journey of this project. This project took 30 years. You know, people needed to connect with this, and they still do. You know, and looking at storytelling, how, you know, the differences in looking at history, just historical, but understanding the importance of people's lives and feelings. I mean, that was just so important to connect with the audience. I did just want to correct the opera I did mention before. It's Fire Shut in My Bones about Charles Blow. I didn't know that one. But success to me, just as storytellers, really just getting our stories out any way that we can. And yeah, I you know, I look at how in publishing, I mean, I remember in the 90s and even late 80s, you know, when the topic of where publishers used to actually say that Black people don't read. And so there was this dearth of Black books written by Black writers. And so, you know, there are waves and ebbs and flows of this. But my thing is that stories need to be told, and in spite of these obstacles, and you have to push through them. And a lot of times, and that's why I think connecting with your audience and knowing who your audience is, because in one of the pushes and that I felt was successful in this was reading groups. You know, people who had book clubs and they were reading and they demanded that publishers publish certain types of books. And so all of this is important, and to me is also adds to the success of writers. And that's why I think, again, as I said before, the importance of us connecting with people, our readers, our the audience, there's nothing that really beats that. There's no replacement for that. And you, and then that's what really drives us getting our stories out there, people reading them, and then they get healing, they learn, the new worlds are open to them. People start traveling to places that they wouldn't have traveled to before necessarily because of a story that they read. So I mean, this is, storytelling to me is never going to die. It is the beat of human life, of humanity, and it has always been. And it is how we have learned of the past and in ancient history to now. So, but the thing I think we have to just keep in mind is the importance of connecting with our audience at all times and building new audiences, reaching new ones.
Alicia.
All of that is very resonant, very true. Like, I think that there's a really strong desire among readers for nonfiction that helps us make sense of our current situation. Like, why are things the way they are? Um, and that's something that I feel like my book has, my recent book has like, connected with like a particular set of readers who like want a particular perspective on that question. And to what Calvin was saying about like the revision of previous historical narratives, like I think, my book is very much like hopefully contributing to a conversation in that area, of like what kind of history have people been taught, what have been sort of the dominant myths that have and it's not only a matter of like, oh, we learned this thing in school that like wasn't true, or how they have really like structured our society in very significant ways and provided, you know, rationale for, a lot of the things that, forms of domination that should be abolished, and that, kind of liberatory storytelling works to abolish those myths. And so, yeah, like I think that uh, my book has kind of found those niches, in like, you know, I think as Tamara said, like book groups, bookstores that have kind of like left political commitments, and yeah, to a certain extent, like word of mouth and like online communities. And so I think that providing people with something that's like useful to them as they both try to make sense of the world and think about like what is possible, um, that would kind of be success for me. And that's something that I, worked really hard to negotiate in this book, like the sense that like certain things feel very intractable. But what history gives us is an understanding of contingency, that this was not necessary or inevitable, and that there are other ways that we can make the world, and that narrative is a part of that. It's like storytelling and cultural work does matter. And we can learn that from looking at the past and the ways that it has mattered, and kind of wielded power, in a way that we would want to critique. Um, but like that, I think, is reinforcement for like why uh, new kinds of stories need to be told and supported, and that there is like a very strong demand for that among readers.
And all of your responses make this publisher very happy because you didn't talk about reviews in the New York Times, though I'm sure you like it or you have them. I'm not sure in this case. You didn't talk about your royalty checks, but you talked about audience reaction and in some sense of responsibility to your readers. and creating new readerships also, right? The readers who you know and the readers who you don't know. I think that I think that's wonderful. That beginning there, we want to see all the other things, but that's the place to start. And I think all three of you have been successful. And thinking further about that, I'd like to ask each one of you to share. I don't know, this is putting you in a position where you may feel I'm asking you to be immodest, but I mean, could you share some traits of your writing or even tricks of the trade that are part of your writing that you would say has given you success as an author? I learned to do this. I fashioned my book this way, and that's why it clicked. And when I spoke with readers, say at different moments, like they really liked that, and I was so gratified to see a sort of intentional decision I made as an author actually affected someone's reading experience in a very positive way. And since I'm asking you to be immodest, I'll ask you to jump in as you feel comfortable.
Okay, I think we're all contemplating. Um, I don't know if there are any like, and that's a difficult question. Like I think if you care about the story that you're telling, it will come across in, you know, in a variety of different ways. And so like I'm kind of struggling to think of like what are specific like tools or like strategies um that like I've used in my work. I definitely especially when you're talking about like sort of a vast historical narrative, um looking for like individual characters who kind of illustrate something about that context, who are like, you know, complex and like engaging for people uh, to think about. I've found that to be hopefully helpful. Um, and I do like weird hooks, like something that's just truly odd or strange or like unbelievable, that like isn't in fact an anomaly, but is connected to some sort of like larger historical trend or set of practices that you can then be like, well, it seems like strange and surprising, but like here's how this comes about. And that's kind of the narrative energy.
I think I would agree with Alicia that these situations differ with everything that you write. One of the baseline for me is always showing, not telling. I mean, you want to connect again. To me, it's about connecting with your reader, connecting with the audience, and how do you bring them into the scene? Like when we opened up our book, um, The Dead Are Rising. I read a little bit of it. We started with the scene in which I'll just read a little bit here. The metallic clicking of hoofbeats of the gravel road drew the 5-year-old Wilfred to the small pane window. His mother, wiping her hands, hurried to the front door as a group of horsemen with flickering torches rode up to the wood frame home on the outskirts of Omaha, Nebraska. Little, yelled one of the half dozen men. Louise Little said that her husband was not home. And with the tree leaves rustling in the evening breeze, the horsemen settled their mounts in the front yard and declared that they were the knights of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm just going to end there because I don't want to read for a long time. But again, you're just bringing people into the scene, sounds, animals, And as the scene even unfolds, we get to see the relationship between Wilfred, the oldest son, with his mother, who is pregnant with Malcolm. Um, how is she responding to this situation of danger, right? Is she angry? Is she afraid? She doesn't, he gets angry, but he likes horses and he remembers this. And we got this information through an interview with Wilfred. And so it's just understanding, just bringing the audience in.
I like that. Not another platitude, but it's a platitude that's a platitude for a reason. The show versus tell distinction. And Calvin, any hallmarks of success that you would want to know, knowing that it's challenging to all?
The only thing that I can say is just start writing. I think for me, sometimes I get so caught up in like the narrative has to be completely, cogent in my head. Like it has to be, beginning, middle, end from the beginning. And I think, especially when it comes to writing about your own story, just starting to put things together, whether it be a voice memo or, now I just sort of sketch ideas out sometimes verbally and then transcribe it and put it into a document and come back to it. I think, especially for fiction, just starting to write is most important, and it won't be completely like edited in the first pass. So I think just starting to write and get the ideas down is really the best way to start. And that's that's the advice that I have for anyone, especially who's watching and listening, starting out.
And staying within the category of success, you've all shared some works, be they fiction, nonfiction, be they operatic. Is there anything you're reading right now that not just that you're enjoying it, but something that is doing just something right? Like this author made some good decisions, and I'm really appreciating them as a reader, and something to point to as a great and in the nonfiction world, a great example of, you know, we say do this. Look at this person. This person's really doing it exceptionally well.
I'm reading, I would say in terms of nonfiction, I would say Michael Arseneau, who just published, I think, his third memoir collection of essays in the last, 5 or 6 years. Um, I think the most recent I just read is I bought my first pair of Jordans. Um, and I would say for fiction, um, Delisha, I can't think of her last name right now, but I'm reading um, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which is a smaller collection. I think it's Delisha Phila or something to that effect. But what I like about it is that it's a really tiny book, and especially thinking about narrative, I think we don't talk about short stories enough in nonfiction. So it's a collection of short stories. There's an overarching theme and there's like characters, but each of the short stories are sort of succinct and discrete. They don't necessarily follow this full narrative from beginning to end. So I thought that was a really creative way to create a novel, but it be a collection of short stories that sort of narratively are around a similar theme, but it doesn't have to be this 300-page story from beginning to end with characters that follow this path or journey. So I thought that, again, people are so creative now in how they're putting together both fiction and nonfiction, and I think sometimes we don't think about short stories enough as in the literary space, especially in the fiction space. That's a great way to start. Is maybe it's just a 3-story short story collection that put together, for sure.
And I can't resist giving a shout out to my university press friends at the University of West Virginia Press, because they published Denisha's that, and what a great work. And also, it just took off. And like the thing we haven't spoken about when defining success, of course, is what your publisher does to help you be successful. And that's for another panel at another time. But is a great example of a small press that could, and in some sense, that book took off precisely because it was with a small press out of West Virginia. Who else? Who else are we reading who's really exemplary or whose work contains some writerly lessons or research lessons?
I will say that like I definitely have read and admired some like kind of academic crossover books, like scholarly books that I think are just very well written and like interesting and engaging for everyone. Um, and kind of based on like qualitative research, like interviews and oral histories, that kind of reflect what Tamara was saying about like how she's engaging with history. And these are just things that I like teach with often. Alondra Nelson's Body and Soul about the Black Panther Party and their health activism. Gabe Winant's book, The Next Shift, which is also about care work in the healthcare industry in Pittsburgh. Like I think those are uh, works that I look to for like again nonfiction writing that is really grounded in very deep scholarship, but like communicates in such a compelling way like people's direct experiences and histories that have been silenced or um, kind of marginalized. Um, and so yeah, I think those are some examples of nonfiction that I think are uh, really well done and like have been pretty widely read and like everyone should read them. And I yeah like I've enjoyed there's just a lot of fiction that I enjoy and actually I'm reading Victor Laval's Lone Women, which is like a historical novel about uh, about sort of frontier like land claims in the West in the early 20th century. And I think that's really, for me, like a intersection of like my interests in like clearly like a lot of historical research went into this. Um, but also it's like a revision of historical narratives in terms of like who has been the protagonist of these books um, and of these myths. And he's kind of rewriting it in a really interesting way.
Cool. Thank you. And Tamara, any exemplary other authors?
I find it funny how I tend to be drawn to people who are either currently journalists or were journalists in a past life. Two examples. One is Joyanne Reed, who just did a book about Medgar Evers and Myrlie Evers and their marriage and their relationship. And she really brings Medgar Evers to the fore because a lot of people think of Medgar Evers, who died in 1963, and that's how they know him and remember him. He died in 1963, but they forget about the importance of his work in Mississippi as a field worker for the NAACP and helping to get registering people to vote in the 60s, but also how he was just organizing people to, also protest for respect, meaning protesting businesses. And she just brings in this history. But what also she brings in is the family life of his marriage with Myrlie, how difficult that was for them, and then even the aftermath after he's assassinated, how she goes on with life. And I just think that looking at a marriage like this was really interesting. Another thing, another person I was read, Cincinnati Redo. She has a series called the Immortal series, and it's one of my favorite series that she's done. Just starting with the story starts in Egypt or Ethiopia and Africa, where they come up some scientific process of being able to achieve immortality. But what happens is, how do these people who have achieved immortality move through the world, navigate through the world? And she did a lot of research as far as the histories that they came into. So they're going through Europe, they're going through Africa, they're going through the United States into present day. So I find that series really intriguing, particularly the first two books of that, My Soul to Keep, and I think it was The Living Blood was the second one. But yeah, I think that what she did as far as world building and research, as far as those histories, and really creating believable characters to relate to, uh, was really well done.
Thank you. And I think that's certainly a theme that's been running through the conversation, is that there is a distinction between the fiction and nonfiction, but there's so many qualities of fiction that bear on the work of nonfiction writers and world building, um, narrative through lines, going back to the word that writers and books used, compelling narratives, all of those terms and all those perspectives you could hear from an editor and a writer in a fiction context. You could hear from an editor and a writer in a nonfiction context, and it is about the reader's experience. And while the readers may be looking for information, or they may be looking for um, a high aesthetic experience, one way or another, they want to be compelled. And the question is, how does one go about that? I think all three of you have helped our listeners and our viewers get a sense of that. And perhaps I'll have some questions, and perhaps they'll follow up with us at some juncture, which would be fantastic. Want to thank Writers and Books for the opportunity to talk here, and share um, great ideas and hear from three great writers. As we look at the end of our time together, I like, if each one of you wants to talk about what's next and why it's going to be a compelling read. I think that would be just wonderful. What's the next book, to be specific, for yourselves?
I think my next book might be a children's book that I've sort of been toying around with. Definitely in the poetry genre, and it'll be about something about be related to gluten free, because there's just not a lot of children's books that speak to um, the gluten free experience specifically from a character that's Black. So I've been toying around with some notes around that.
Alicia, what's next? And why is it
Yeah.
going to be great?
Similarly, like I am looking at an archive, like a historical archive that I think is better dealt with in fiction than in nonfiction. And so I'm kind of moving in that direction in terms of like, uh, I've spent a lot of time with this material, and I feel like I have a sense of who these people were. Um, but their story is so weird that I would like to be able to tell it in fiction in order to like fully like give them like let them have voices and just like you know set scenes and dialogues and events that are not specifically recorded um, in their in their papers. So I think that's challenging to me, and I'm still kind of freaked out by it. But I think it will also be really fun.
Mara.
Working on projects around my father. His life was important as a journalist, and I just think that his voice is missed right now, and I wanted to help continue preserving that.
Wonderful. Well, I wish all three of you well with your work. And I thank Writers and Books for bringing us together. I thank Sakshi for convening us expertly and keeping us on track and well within the system. And thanks, everyone.
I just want to echo that thank you. Thank you, Alicia, Calvin, Tamara, and Michael. Thank you for being here today and for sharing your time and your work with us, and your knowledge with us. It's been such a gift sharing this space with you all. As a reminder, our panelists and our moderators' books will be available through our bookstore, and I urge you to support them in any way that you can. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Calvin. Feel
Bye.
better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Feel better,
You're a
Calvin.
trooper. You're a trooper.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really great meeting you all.
Same.
It was so nice meeting you too. Thank you.
Don't be strangers and send good book projects to University of South Carolina Press, please.
Absolutely.
All
All right,
right.
Yeah.
I got a dash to make dinner.
All
Care.
right.
Bye.
Bye.